Hey U.S. history students, today we're talking about two major topics from the Gilded Age, the late 1800s. We're talking about urbanization, which is people moving into cities. You see a huge crowding in the cities in the United States, and also immigration. You have a huge influx of immigrants coming to the United States in the late 1800s. During the late 1800s, we see a huge growth in the U.S. cities. The reason for this is mainly because the United States is going through a stage of industrialization. You see more factories springing up, more machinery being used, and more machinery being used on the farms in the rural areas. And so when you have more machinery, that takes the place of human jobs. And so those people have to have work somewhere, and so farmers lose their jobs, and those workers move to the factories in the city. And then also, obviously, there's lots more stuff to do in the city, more cultural opportunities, and you add on the fact that you have tons of immigrants coming to the U.S., you just have a huge boom in U.S. cities. If you take a look at this chart, which is showing the rural and urban populations in the U.S., starting in 1860 and going to 1920, in 1860 we see a huge amount of people in rural areas as opposed to urban areas. But by the time we get to 1920, we can see that the urban areas have outgrown the rural areas. So now that we have this huge growth in cities, it's causing cities to have problems that they have never had before. So we're changing the landscape. Urbanization is changing the landscape, so we no longer have trees and fields. We have cities growing out with brick and roads, and the people that are running the cities can't keep up with all the problems. Several of the problems that are occurring because of this huge growth in cities is the streets. So they're not used to the amount of traffic that they're now getting. You're having a lot of factories being built and being used, and trains being used to transport people, and that's causing a lot of pollution. A lot of people in a small condensed area like a city produces a lot of pollution, especially when no one's watching that sort of thing and making sure that no one is polluting the water or the air or whatever. And then you've got sewage. You don't have a good place to put sewage, and that's being spread around. You've got sewage contaminating the drinking water, and you've got families moving into tenements like this right here, where you have a family of 4, 5, 6, 7 people living in a small apartment building, a lot of times without windows, without good ventilation, without heat, and so it's like sardines in a can. A few more issues that occur in these growing cities in the United States in the Gilded Age is you're going to have inadequate public services, so you're not going to have good police, good hospitals, good fire department, good schools, or at least ones that can keep up with the growth. And so a lot of people are doing without. And then transportation, the streets are getting clogged. You have horses, you have carriages, you have trolleys, all these things in a small space in roads that aren't built to withstand the amount of traffic that they're getting. And then you've got overcrowding, like we talked about just a second ago, the tenements. Families don't have heat, they don't have fresh air, they don't have plumbing, a lot of them don't have windows or daylight, and they're just crammed in there. And then social tensions. You've got the rich people living in the cities, and you've got poor people moving into the cities looking for factory jobs, etc. And so you have this mixing and mingling of people, and the poorer classes are seeing the luxuries that the wealthy have, and so you're having this increase in crime and tension among the upper class and the lower class. And that moves us into another issue that we're having during this time, is the growth of political machines. Now, political machines is not like a machine that runs on gas or whatever. This is actually an organization of people. It's a corrupt organization, but it's a political organization that basically it runs a city because it gets support from from supporters, from businesses, from people that they reward for getting their vote. So basically, it's this thing that goes like, hey, if you give me your vote, then I'll give you something in return. It may be a job, it may be an apartment, it may be coal to heat your house for the winter or whatever. And so they're basically paying people for their votes, and they stay in office, and they give favors to their supporters, and then they run the government. And some of the things these political machines do is they provide jobs or services for immigrants, because immigrants come to this country, and there's a huge influx in the immigrant population during this time period, and they have nothing. They don't have a job, they don't have a house, they don't have anything. And so they're really easy to get their vote in exchange for giving them something. And a lot of times they would have the support of local business leaders, and what they would do is they would make money illegally by either collecting bribes, or they would build city projects, like build a road, and they would give the company who's building the road extra money, and that company would then give them kickbacks, would give them money back. So let's say if I'm a political boss and I'm going to have a road built, I'm going to pay this road builder $1 million to build the road, which is way more than it's worth, but then he's going to kick me back $600,000. So I'm going to make money on it, he's going to make money on it, the city is what's losing out, the taxpayer is what's losing out on the money. One of the most famous political bosses, his name was Boss Tweed. Now Boss Tweed, he was a boss in New York, and he controlled New York and all of its city workers, its hospitals, its schools, all of its services. He would bribe lawmakers to pass laws that would help him stay in office, help him make money, help him gain votes. And he made money himself because he would overpay himself on construction projects. Like I was just saying a second ago, he would overpay the construction company, and the construction company would secretly give him money back, which is illegal. And the name of his group was Tammany Hall. That was the name of his political organization. So he was Boss Tweed. Tammany Hall was not a place. It was his political organization. And here you can see a political cartoon. This is Boss Tweed. He's got his thumb on New York, and it says New York is under the thumb. And Boss Tweed says, well, what are you going to do about it? Nothing. He controls everything. All right, now we're going to move on to another major issue that's hitting the United States during the Gilded Age, and it's the immigration of foreigners moving into the United States looking for a better opportunity. These immigrants are coming to the United States for a lot of different reasons. A lot of them are obvious. They're being pushed out by oppression or poverty or war in their country, or they're being persecuted for some reason. And they're being pulled to the United States because the United States has what they're looking for. It has freedom, economic opportunity. Maybe their friends and family are already here, and they're coming to join them. For whatever reason, they're being pushed out of where they are, and they're being pulled to the United States. And previously in U.S. history, before 1880, there was big waves of immigration, but most of those immigrants were coming from Northern Europe, places like Great Britain, Ireland, and Germany. Most of them were Protestant. Most of them spoke English. And so they came into the United States and they fit in. They looked like what Americans looked like. They spoke like Americans spoke. They had the same faith values as most Americans did at the time, those Protestant values. And so they fit in very well. After 1880, from 1880 to 1920, you have another huge wave of immigrants. But this time, the pattern is changing a little bit. You have a bunch of new railroads being built across Europe, and you have a lot of large ships being built they're making the voyage from Europe over to the United States easier and less expensive. And so you have poorer people now have the ability to come to the United States. And so you have more people from Eastern and Southern Europe over here moving to the United States. And a lot of times they did not speak English. They were not Protestant. They were Catholic or Jewish or Orthodox. And they didn't look like normal Americans. And they didn't really fit in, and they didn't speak English, and so they had a harder time fitting in. This new wave of immigrants are coming from a different part of Europe. And traveling to the United States by ship all the way across the Atlantic Ocean was tough. They faced many hardships. A lot of them had to travel in the steerage, which means they had to travel below the water line, way down to the bottom of the ship. And when they arrived, most of them arrived in Ellis Island in New York. They settled in cities, which led to the growth of cities and those problems that we talked about earlier. A lot of them were poor because they came here with hardly anything, and they worked long hours, low pay, they dressed differently, they looked differently, they lived in crowded areas, and they didn't really fit in with normal Americans and well, I say normal Americans, average Americans that were already in the United States. And so these Americans were looking on these foreigners with distrust. And so these immigrants, they moved into areas with relatives of the same nationality and people that have the same nationality as them, spoke the same language as them. And so you see places like Little Italy rise, or Little China, or these places start to spring up where you have this group of people that all come from the same country, same nationality, that speak the same language and have the same customs as themselves, same religion as themselves, somewhere where they feel like they can fit in. So you see these groupings in a lot of big cities full of immigrants. All right, that leads us to the process of Americanization. Now, Americanization means learning to dress, speak, and act like Americans. And a lot of these immigrants, when they came over, they didn't have time to learn English, and they didn't have time to learn how to dress and how to fit into society. They were busy working and trying to provide for their family. Because remember, they came here with hardly anything, no money, nowhere to live, nowhere to go, nothing to do. And so they were busy. They were trying to make a living for their family. So most of the adults were not the ones that became Americanized. It was mainly their children that eventually became assimilated. Assimilated means giving up your culture and adopting the new culture. And the children were Americanized because of the public school system. A lot of them went into public schools. They learned English. They learned American customs. They learned American values. They learned how to dress and act like an American. And so it wasn't till usually the second generation, maybe the third generation, that really became Americanized in this process of Americanization. Another aspect of American society that started to come out during this rise and this surge in immigrants into the United States in the late 1880s is this rise in nativism. Nativism is basically a hostility towards immigrants. It's feeling like other races, religions, and nationalities are inferior. They're not good. They threaten Native American values, etc. And so they didn't like them. They didn't want them in the country. And these nativists also argue that immigrants took their jobs because they're willing to work for less. And so they come here, they work for less, they take American jobs, they don't speak our language, they don't have our same religion, they don't look like us, we don't trust them. And so that's kind of the nativist sentiment that really rises during this time period. And there's this cultural tension, cultural conflict going on in the big cities in the United States. And because of that cultural tension, you have what leads to the first law, federal U.S. law, that actually restricts immigration. In 1882, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it was basically passed. It's a law that's passed that bans Chinese from coming into the country, Chinese workers, for 10 years. So state and federal courts could not issue citizenship to Chinese residents. And so people just were looking for someone to blame. There was a surge in unemployment. People didn't have jobs, and so they blamed the Chinese. They blamed these immigrants that were coming into California and other parts of the West for taking away jobs. And they got Congress to pass this law, the first law that restricts immigration to the U.S. And so you can see this political cartoon right here. Says the only one barred out, and it's a Chinese immigrant, and he's bringing industry and order and peace and sobriety, but he's not allowed in. But they let in all these people